Hey YouTube, it's Pastor Dwayne here. So today we have Dr. Peter Gurry and Dr. Maurice Robinson with us. And I wanted to bring them on the channel to talk a little bit about text types. If you haven't seen my discussion with Heaven Jones earlier, watch that after this. We discussed text types, him more from a secondary perspective, but we have Dr. Robinson and Dr. Gurry here who were there at the colloquium to discuss text types. So I will get these gentlemen to say hello to everybody.
Hello, everybody.
And hello from me.
I want to start off here and ask Dr. Gurry, what is it that caused you to call this symposium on text types?
Well, first of all, I co-direct the Text and Canon Institute, and so one of the things that we try to do here is foster good biblical scholarship. So every couple years or so, we try to have one of these academic colloquia where we bring together experts on a subject, particular subject related to the history of the Bible, and try to tackle it. So that's part of the background as to why we were able to do it. Why did I want to do this particular subject? Primarily because ever since my own dissertation, I have felt that there are some problems with the definition and the use of text types. And even just more than my own sort of suspicions, other people have been raising questions about them for over a decade now. And so I was pretty convinced that there's a bit of a ferment among text critics about these things. Again, some people like David Parker basically saying we need to abandon them, and we can and should. And so just in talking to colleagues about it over the years, I've felt certain people want to push back, but not sure how, or maybe they weren't ready to, or who knows what. But somebody like Eldon Epp has written in defense of something close to text types, what he calls textual clusters. So there's basically just there's a bit of a ferment among experts, I think, among text critics on this question, with some people saying it's time to do away with them altogether. We can finally move beyond them. And then others saying, wait a minute. We can still preserve something close to text type. So one of the nice things about doing a colloquium is you can actually bring people together in the room, rather than having people kind of talk across articles that are separated by years in different journals. You can actually all sit down and over lunch hash some things out. So anyways, that's some of the impetus behind it.
Okay, very good. So now what is it? What do we mean by the term text type? Maybe I'll get Dr. Robinson first. So for my viewers, Dr. Robinson represents kind of like a Byzantine priority perspective, whereas Dr. Peter Gurry represents a critical text perspective. I'm sure there's more nuancing there, but I think that's good enough for now. So from the Byzantine priority perspective, what is meant by the term text type?
This goes back to the long history of the terminology. And if you're going back to the time of Griesbach and Bengel and that, they came up with the idea of a recension-based theory where text types were the product of formal recensions, and that never the three shall meet, because they were looking at three basic text types, whether you want to call them in current terms Alexandrian, Western, and Byzantine. But the idea was that they had this recensional background, and that kind of baggage has carried along with the name to a high degree. And I think that is part of the motivation why the suggestions are out there to eliminate that term particularly. And I pointed out in my presentation, and this will also be in the paper as prepared for the book that will be published of the conference, that I have been using the term clusters since I wrote my master's thesis back in 1975. And even before that, when I was examining some textual alignments in the Gospels, I was convinced that it was better to use the term cluster than text type, because it eliminates the baggage and also doesn't require a strict membership saying if you have this particular manuscript, it must belong to this particular text type, because manuscripts, as you can tell by some of their readings, they flow into and flow out of a given textual cluster designation, whatever it might be.
Right. So just for our viewers, when you say recension, what you're talking about is like a formal process of editing imposed upon a work. So in the classical sense of a text type, the four types we often hear. Now, you only mentioned the three, not the Caesarean, but the Alexandrian, the Byzantine, and the Western would have been edited by somebody and then promulgated from there. So what you're saying is that text types refers back to the term text types refers back to this editing process, whereas you're sort of bringing out this newer, maybe it's not newer, but you're suggesting that we use the term cluster instead because it takes away the baggage of recensional theory.
Right. The term cluster comes from actually what was taking place. Scientific American had an article by a fellow named Sokol, and he was the one that was applying it in classification of biology, and John G. Griffith picked it up and used it for classifying New Testament manuscripts, and he called it numerical taxonomy.
Interesting.
And that's where that's coming from. And the reason, by the way, I didn't mention the Caesarean is because it does not go back to the historic view of where text types would have originated. The Caesarean type only came about in some studies in the 20th century, and there have been debates over how much of a text type or cluster the Caesarean actually happens to be, but that's a separate issue from the actual origin of the term text type.
All right. So Peter, I'm going to turn it over to you. Do you have anything to add to what Maurice has said about text types?
The issue of definition is the central one. So my own opinion is that using the term clusters doesn't really get us anywhere because the issue is how do we actually define them? Personally, I don't find great hope in this term clusters.
Right.
But
right.
we can get on to that later. So, but no, I think, I agree with Maurice and what he said on sort of the origin of the term, going back to Bengal and Griesbach, that's important. I think Griesbach is the first one to connect the text types to particular geographical locales, which I don't think anybody today really defends. You might be able to find somebody, but I don't think anybody today really thinks, anybody who's still willing to talk about the Alexandrian text type today probably does not think it's limited to Alexandria, Egypt. The Caesarean text type, Maurice is, yeah, he's right about that. It's always kind of been this debatable one. Does it really exist or is it something else?
Okay. So the next question then is that's a little bit about the history of text types, but I guess the next one is sort of how were they discovered? Like, did somebody accidentally realize that there were readings there? Like, how did it develop? Maybe we'll start with you, Peter.
It's a good question. I mean, it's tied up in Bengal's overall sort of attempt at a way to explain how to do text criticism. And I think as I've read the sources, and I'm not the expert on the history of it like I need to be, but if I've read like in Bengal, and then especially I'm more familiar with, say, Westcott and Hort, my general sense is that nobody is discovering them by doing detailed comparisons, or if they are, they're not presenting the data. So you won't, for example, find in Bengal or Griesbach or Westcott and Hort tables of agreements and disagreements between witnesses. You don't really get that, I don't think, until somebody like Colwell. So my suspicion is that what's happening is these scholars are working with various witnesses and they're noticing interesting agreements where certain witnesses tend to kind of clump together over the course of a set of readings. Usually in the Gospels, it's important to keep in mind the text types really develop in the Gospels first and then sort of get applied to other parts of the New Testament. Okay, so nobody's ever really cared that much about text types in, say, the Catholic letters. And when you get to the book of Acts, let's say, I mean, you have a sort of Western text that people will talk about and an Alexandrian text. I don't think anybody, Maurice can correct me, but I don't think anybody's really ever talked about a Caesarean text in Acts. Or am I wrong about that, Maurice?
I did.
Oh, you did. Okay. So I'm wrong about that.
Actually, this goes back to the master's thesis that we were talking about, which was mine on textual interrelationships in the book of Acts. And from the method that I used, and I'm not even going to go into detail of it, but it basically was following Griffith's near neighbor clusters methodology. There was at least one cluster, a small cluster, that could be termed Caesarean by virtue of it not being Byzantine, not being Western, and not being Alexandrian. So you've got a hanging cluster there that just happens to also, some of the manuscripts within it happen to be within the ones that they previously had thought might be Caesarean elsewhere. So that's where it came from. Now, does anyone else hold to a Caesarean in Acts? I have no idea.
So I think,
Okay.
for example, when you get to Griesbach, Dwayne,
Yep.
Griesbach has an Alexandrian, and he ties it to Alexandria through origin. Okay. Then he has the Western, which especially is named because he thinks these are, he can identify this through readings that are especially found in Latin versions and patristic fathers who are in the West, right? Like Irenaeus. Okay. Then he has the Eastern that he thinks is used in Antioch and Constantinople. And again, he can tie these to particular patristic authors. So it's kind of a combination of certain readings that, wow, we find these readings, these readings tend to have these distinctive readings and say, Old Latin witnesses or in Codex Beza, for example. Okay, so that becomes a kind of text type, right? But I don't know that it's really worked out in granular detail until you get to somebody like Colwell, who really tries to put numbers on these things. Does that make sense?
That's where we get the 90%, 10% rule, right?
Yeah, exactly. Although I think it's 70-10. Is that right, Maurice?
70-10. That's right. That's 70%
70-10.
agreement and 10% disagreement from other types. And as I understand it with CBGM, that formula kind of faded out. Like it just kind of imploded. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, it basically does not work at all. Now, to be fair, Colwell it comes down to what you count, because Colwell is very clear in what you should and should not count. So I think Colwell would probably look at something like the ECM and say, well, it doesn't work partly because you're counting the wrong things.
Right.
Right. He would say something like you're counting too much. Now, I'm not sure his numbers even worked always in his own day. And I'm not sure even if we followed his principles, they would still work, really. But you have to commend him for at least trying to give a real definition of these things, right? So Maurice mentioned earlier, he talked about witnesses. How did you say it, Maurice? Coming into a stream and then coming out of it? Is that what you said?
Well, they may pertain to a particular cluster, but they will flow in and out.
They will flow in and out. Okay. So just notice that language of in and out. In order to know when something is in or out, you have to know what the something they are in is, so that you know when they get out of it. Right? And so to do that, you have to know where the boundary is. Where's the boundary that makes a witness in the thing? Where's the boundary that makes the witness then out of it? And Colwell, I think what he does is he at least tries to give concrete definition to those boundaries. Where Westcott and Hort, they have readings in their mind. They're not making this stuff up, but they just don't really present it. And I think part of it is because they didn't feel the need to. By their day, these categories were pretty well regarded by everybody. And so they didn't really need to give sort of detailed lists of agreements and disagreements to prove that, say, I'm trying to think of like a witness like Codex L is Alexandrian, or that Beza is Western. Everybody, I think, already pretty much agreed at the time. So they didn't need to make a big argument for it. What they did need to argue for, and what they did argue for, is that Vaticanus and Sinaiticus were their so-called neutral text. That was new to them, and that they did need to argue for in some greater detail. But keep in mind, those two manuscripts were fairly new at the time in terms of having like complete access to them, right? Sinaiticus was very new. Vaticanus was newer in that, people hadn't always had access to a complete to all its text. People only had access to selections of it. So, and then you got to add to that, they didn't have access to any of the papyri, right? Okay. They didn't have a manuscript like Codex W yet. So if you think of something like P45 and W and the relationship, people have tried to argue for that for, say, a Caesarean text, that's not on their radar because they don't even have those manuscripts to think about, So it is important for us to remember that when we think about the history of this question. You've got to remember what witnesses people even have, right? Again, something like the old Syriac Gospels, those are also discovered in the time period of Westcott and Hort. So Griesbach doesn't even know about the old Syriac Gospels, right? Because at least one of them is in a monastery at Mount Sinai that nobody's seen yet. outside of the monastery.
Interesting.
So anyways, that's a longer answer, but
Okay, so let me go back to the Colwell's 70-10 rule. Dr. Robinson, uh, would you, from a Byzantine perspective, see 70-10 as a fail?
Oh, the rule failed from the beginning because it's not my position, it's the position of other textual critics who immediately went after Colwell and said this rule cannot be applied in practice. It just doesn't work. So the Colwell rule for trying to determine a text type by percentage relationships, I think that's where the mistake came. You're looking for percentages of agreement and a percentage of difference or distance from another so-called text type, and these are not hard and fast divisions. They don't exist. And if one manuscript is mostly with one textual cluster, but sometimes with another one, what do you do then? Because that could not possibly fit Colwell's rule. So I think the rule was dead from the beginning, but it sounded good at the time he wrote his article on it, and he had no access to the materials they have today, for example, such as the ECM and the text and textvert series or anything like that. Would he still have said the same had he had that amount of material? Somehow I don't think he could have done it. He'd have had some other concept.
Okay, so then that brings brings us to the next question, which is this: what use did text types have? I mean, we're talking about whether or not they exist, but there must have been some sort of utilitarian function that text type had. So I'll start with Dr. Gurry, and you seem to be moving in the direction of, well, we shouldn't be too concerned with text types. So what kind of question did they answer? Why did we have them for the last 100 and so many years?
yeah. So in my paper at the conference, I gave three things, and you could probably add to this, but I think these are the three big ones. I think the first thing that they've done for us historically is they've simplified the problem. And the basic problem is we have so many witnesses to manage. Okay.
Right.
So, and we've only had more and more, right? So in Mill's day, he's got about 100 in his apparatus. That's in 1707, right? But then today, I mean, your ECM has well over 100 manuscripts in each volume, plus versions, plus patristics, and that's still not all of them, right? In the Gospel of Mark, say you've got 1,600 plus just Greek manuscripts. Okay. Who can possibly manage a judgment or an evaluation of all 1,600? You can't.
Right.
You can't, imagine thinking of like a football game, or maybe, sorry, Dwayne, I should make this more relevant.
Hockey.
Imagine a hockey imagine a hockey game with 1,600 players on the what is it, a field, a court, what is it,
The arena.
ice?
Yeah,
the arena. Okay,
the hockey
sorry,
arena.
I'm showing myself as an American here. Who can keep 1,600 players distinct in their mind, and their qualities, the things they're good at and the things that they're bad at, right? You can't do that. It's too many. So text types have allowed us to simplify the problem. It's so much easier to evaluate 3 or 4 things than 1,600 things.
Right.
Okay. So it's not that hard to come up with characteristics for these big categories we call text types. And that's exactly what people have done. So if you read something like Metzger's textual commentary, he will give these descriptions of the text types and say things like the Western text shows a love of paraphrase.
Right.
He'll give these kind of characteristics to them. That's really helpful because it allows you to kind of form an opinion in your mind of how to think about these things. And then that then allows you to do 2 more things. One is you can then tell the story of the text much easier. So you can tell it a couple of ways, okay? If you're a reason eclectic, you can tell the story as well. The Alexandrian is the earliest text type, and it's the best, right? Tends to have the shorter text, so it's not prone to these expansionistic readings or these harmonizations that you find, say, in the Western text. It doesn't combine readings like we find in the Byzantine text. And so you start to imagine like a scenario where you've got this early Alexandrian text, and then developing alongside of it is a Western text, and then those two get merged in the Byzantine text. And that's, roughly speaking, Westcott and Hort's theory of the text development. That's the story they tell about it. If you're somebody like Maurice Robinson, you take that same story, you flip it on its head, right? And you say the Byzantine text is the earliest one, represents the earliest text, and then from it develops these two other ones, right? Okay.
Right.
And whichever story you accept is less important to my point, because my point is just to say you can tell a story much easier when you only have three characters in the story. Right. So again, it gets back to this issue of it makes things a lot easier. Okay. And then the last thing that they do that's also quite important, my students love this one. Although I don't teach them text types, they still manage to discover them somehow in reading other books that I don't.
They're watching my YouTube channel. That's what's
they're
going
watching
on.
your YouTube channel. That's what it is. So the last thing they do is they help us make decisions. Okay. So if you're at a place in the Gospels and you've got, let's say you get lucky and you've got three different readings, one reading is found in a lot of witnesses that Metzger tells you are Alexandrian, either primary or secondary. And another reading is found mostly in witnesses that he tells you are Western. And then the third reading is found in witnesses he tells you are mostly Byzantine, right? And he's given you these characteristics of the three and said the Byzantine has this, these tendencies and characteristics. The Western tends to paraphrase and the Byzantine tends to conflate readings and smooth things. Okay. And if you've been told kind of like, well, the Alexandrian is generally better, the Western is early, but maybe not as good, and then the Byzantine is the worst. Okay. If that's what a student learns, that makes the decisions a lot easier, doesn't it? Because then you find the reading that fits those three categories and you're kind of done. And I think it's always had an appeal to both students and also commentators, but let's be fair to text critics as well. So, you cannot read 2 pages in Metzger's textual commentary without getting him mentioning these text types, right?
Right.
Here's the Byzantine reading, here's the Alexandrian reading, and whatever. So, so I think those are the 3 things that historically they have done for people and why they have persisted so long and been so central. They simplify the problem. They help us tell the story of the text, and they help us make textual decisions.
Okay. So I'm going to push it over to Dr. Robinson and see if you have anything to add to the question of what use did text types have. We'll talk about whether they still have a use in a moment, but I just want you to focus on what use they had.
Well, they are simplifications. I agree completely with Dr. Gurry. It's much easier to say, if I have a triple division and I can say this reading is Alexandrian, this one is Western, this one is Byzantine. This is basically what a fellow named Hammond did when he did his book on triple divisions in the New Testament. And it made it easy because then all you had to do was decide which one of those 3 groups, text types, whatever you want to call them, which reading do you wish to follow? And it's much simpler if you decide, oh, I think the Alexandrian text is better, or I think the Western, or I think the Byzantine is better. And then your choice is only 1 out of 3. And if you're using like the hockey game analogy with today's 1,600 players, text types are really like going to another good Canadian sport, curling.
There you go.
You've got
Very
the
good.
Byzantine and the Alexandrian pushing those blocks, and then the Western people are out there with a little broom sweeping. That's what's going on. Mm-hmm. And it simplifies it, and that's why curling only needs a few people and hockey needs more, but nobody wants all 1,600 on the field at once.
Right.